Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Amanda Benton, Assistant Director of Alumni Relations at Marist and a graduate from the class of 2011. After our May webinar focusing on the Regatta Collection, a number of alumni asked for a more in-depth look at the history of the event itself. So today we're very excited to welcome back Elizabeth Clarke and joining her and Sandri from the Marist Archives and Special Collections for a deeper dive into the Poughkeepsie Regatta. Before we begin, I'd like to go over some technical notes. If you encounter any audio issues, you do have the option to dial in by telephone. We'll be providing that number and code in the chat box. Due to the number of participants, we have muted all lines except for the host and the presenters. We're going to reserve the chat option for any technical questions you have or general questions for the Marist staff who are hosting today. Please do not send private messages to either Anne or Elizabeth as they may not see them while presenting. Please use the Q&A feature for questions that you have about the presentation and be sure to direct the questions to the host, and we will get to those towards the end of the presentation. There are several ways you can view this on your screen. On a desktop or laptop, you hover over the top right corner of the video portion of your screen with your mouse. Small icon should appear. The preferred choice for a webinar like this, because it includes both slides and video, is side-by-side view. On a mobile device, you should be able to swipe between the video and presentation slides. There will be a brief survey on your screen at the conclusion of the webinar. It'll pop up as a new tab in your browser. We would appreciate it if you could take a minute, as it would be extremely helpful to hear your feedback. So without further ado, I would like to formally introduce our hosts, Elizabeth Clarke and Anne Sandri, both librarian assistants for the Archives and Special Collections at Marist College. Elizabeth, Anne, thank you for coming back to provide a more in-depth look at the Poughkeepsie Regatta and for spending time with all of us this afternoon.
Okay. Hi, how are you? Elizabeth is going to introduce the Poughkeepsie Regatta, the complete history, and then we're going to take turns going through the slides in today's presentation.
Elizabeth, you're still muted. There you go.
Thank you. So without further ado, we'll get started. The Poughkeepsie Regatta was a rowing competition held on the Hudson River between the city of Poughkeepsie and the town of Highland in Ulster County, starting in 1895 and ending in 1949. It was initially a competition between Columbia University, Cornell University, and the University of Pennsylvania. And it started with a 1 4-mile race between the varsity eights of each school. Anne will tell you a little bit about some rowing terminology before we get started.
Oops, one too many. All right, let's see if I can go back here. Hold on. Okay, there we go. All right, we wanted to make you familiar with some of the terminology that you're going to be hearing during the presentation. Here's a couple of things. The IRA, when we refer to that, we mean the Intercollegiate Rowing Association. The shell is the boat that they rowed in. When we talk about varsity 8, freshman 8, junior varsity 8, those are crew teams consisting of 8 rowers and a coxswain. The varsity 4 was a crew team consisting of 4 rowers, and that one did not have a coxswain. The coxswain is the crew member at the back of the boat, facing the team, calling out the stroke, and navigating the shell. And the observation train were regular train cars that were converted to hold bleachers, and spectators would ride up and down the west bank of the Hudson as the races were being rowed.
The terms that are on here are not necessarily technical terms, but just to clarify when we talk about things, because there's a variety of different facilities at Poughkeepsie. So when we refer to a boathouse, we're talking about simple plank buildings at the water's edge that were just used for the boat and equipment storage. They didn't usually hold up very well over time in the elements. You can actually see one in the picture at the bottom of the slide. This is one that was on the west side of the Hudson. So the crews did not stay in these. These were just for storing equipment. When we talk about quarters, we're talking about places where the crews actually slept, ate, and lived when they weren't out rowing on the Hudson. And they were often hotels, boarding houses, schools, private residences. Regatta Row is the thing that combines these two, the boathouses and quarters, into one. So these boathouses were deliberately constructed for the regatta as a permanent place to store equipment, and later on became converted so that they could actually, the crew teams could live in there as well. These were actually owned by the city of Poughkeepsie. They were along the Hudson River, actually right in front of where Marist is now. And the structures included the MIT/Washington Boathouse. They each occupied that at different points. University of California, Berkeley's Boathouse, Cornell University Boathouse, and Dining Hall at the University of Washington. Okay, so how did this all get started? So university rowing in the United States has been in existence since the early 19th century. The oldest rowing competition consistently running began in 1852 between Harvard and Yale University. This was a 4-mile race between the varsity crews of those two universities. And they did expand it and have additional competitions and invited other universities, and other rowing associations existed before the one that came to Poughkeepsie. But how the Poughkeepsie Regatta came to be is a direct result of this Harvard-Yale agreement. Cornell began building up its rowing program in the 1870s, even going as far as to hire a professional coach, Charles Courtney, who had been a professional rower. And as they got, more competitive and more interested in, these contests, they wanted to test themselves out against Harvard and Yale, being as this was one of the oldest competitions in the country, and it would add to their prestige if they were allowed to compete. Harvard and Yale would not permit this, and so eventually Cornell and Pennsylvania, who has also attempted to join the Harvard-Yale competition, elected to withdraw from the competitions at New London, where Harvard and Yale race, and form their own rowing association, the Intercollegiate Rowing Association. They invited Columbia to join them. So in December 1891, representatives from the 3 schools met in New York City and formed the association. You'll see here on the screen, these are actually things that were sold when people purchased tobacco. So they had different schools represented on silks or felt, which is what the Pennsylvania one is at the bottom. Just ways for people to show their support of the schools. We're highly collective, but we thought it was a nice way to represent each of the schools. Well, despite forming the rowing association, it would take a few years before they would actually hold a race with all 3 schools due to some recruiting difficulties at Columbia. It took a long time for them to get a varsity level crew together.
So 1895 is the first regatta that takes place on the Hudson at Poughkeepsie. Selecting the course was the first step for the IRA, and several cities offered up lakes and rivers near them, but the IRA ultimately chose Poughkeepsie. Some of the other places that were offered up were Newburgh, Nyack, and Saratoga. One of the reasons it was chosen, it was no one's home course, so no one had practice there. Everyone had to adjust and learn the course. It was a straight 4-mile stretch between Crum Elbow and Highland and below what is now the Mid-Hudson Bridge. The sloping shores down to the river on both sides allowed for multiple viewing points for the spectators, and the ability to run an observation train on the western shore of the Hudson to follow the race was also a very attractive thing. Poughkeepsie and Highland Rowing Association approached the IRA offering the course. They arranged for quarters, boathouses, and anything else the crews needed. Pennsylvania stayed at Bellevue Villa in Highland. It was a hotel, and they used a boathouse that was built for them along the river below the hotel. Columbia stayed in Hyde Park at the Stuyvesant Estate, which was a private home located on what is now the Culinary Institute of America, and they were loaned a boathouse by the Roosevelt family. Cornell lived at Cannon House, built by architect George Cannon on Prospect Street in Poughkeepsie. This house is also known as the Hicks Place and River Villa. They used a boat builder's building on the river near where Main Street goes to the river, and none of these buildings exist any longer. So 1895 race day. brought about some interesting things, having been the first event of this type, rowed on the Hudson for this. Governor Morton of New York had arranged to follow the race in his boat, and the driver was a little overeager and got too close to the crews as they approached the starting line. The wake of the boat sent up a wave that propelled Pennsylvania Shell into the dock and damaged it. The race was postponed for 2 days so that Pennsylvania had the opportunity to repair their shell. Columbia won the first regatta, with Cornell placing second, and unfortunately, Pennsylvania did not finish as their shell took on too much water and could not be rowed to the finish, also known as swamping. Many were outraged about this and speculated that the outcome may have been different had the race not been postponed. Many believed that Morton, who was running for president, would not receive a vote from Pennsylvania. Ultimately, he did not win, but there's little evidence that the regatta had anything to do with it.
So with the success of the 1895 regatta, they decided to reprise it in 1896. But at this point, Harvard and Yale become involved. Columbia had maintained good relations with both schools despite Cornell and Pennsylvania's desire to part with the two, and formed a rowing agreement with Harvard so that they would row together for 2 years. Columbia suggested that instead of rowing a separate race elsewhere, that Harvard should come to Poughkeepsie. Harvard eventually agreed to come and row in the IRA regatta, and at this point, speculation was rampant that Yale would come as well. Yale ultimately elected to go to the Henley Regatta in the United Kingdom and did not come to Poughkeepsie in 1896. As a result of Harvard's attendance, they added another race. Instead of just a varsity 8 race, they added a freshman race between the 8s from all 4 schools. In honor of these new participants, the local organizers put together buttons commemorating the regatta, and you can see one on the screen. The ribbons on them actually represent the school colors. So they had one for Pennsylvania, one for Columbia, and one for Harvard and Cornell. This one is either Harvard or Cornell, as both have the colors of red and white. You'll see also the victorious Cornell crew who won both races that year. So when 1897 comes around, Yale elects not to go across the ocean to the Henley and expects to row their traditional race with Harvard at New London in Connecticut. Harvard points out that they have an agreement with Columbia and feel that they have to honor it. Yale doesn't see any problem rowing with the IRA, but they want them all to come to their usual course in Connecticut and not come to Poughkeepsie. The IRA universities objected to the course at New London, wanting to stay on Poughkeepsie, considering it to be the superior course. Yale ultimately comes to Poughkeepsie as a result of their objections. But Yale decides that they are not going to row against Columbia and Pennsylvania. So this year they decide that they're going to hold 4 races, 2 varsity 8 races, one between Cornell, Yale, and Harvard, and another between the varsities of Cornell, Columbia, and Pennsylvania. And the same setup for the 2 freshman races. And these were held over about 2 weeks. They had 2 races per week. Cornell wins all but one. Yale took the freshman race between Cornell, Harvard, and Yale. This, doesn't make Yale terribly happy, and neither Yale nor Harvard returned to Poughkeepsie. The fact that Cornell was able to triumph over Yale and Harvard was a very big deal for them at this point. It gives them prestige, and it really, gives them a reputation as a rowing program.
In 1898 through 1900, the regatta sees some new additions. The 1898 race was actually held at Saratoga Lake, and it didn't go well as the weather was terrible and the rowing conditions were not great. But in 1898, the University of Wisconsin began to participate in the regatta, and they come to Poughkeepsie in 1899. Wisconsin almost wins the race at Poughkeepsie that year, but is prevented when they need to avoid a berry crate floating in the river. As you'll notice, there's an image of a team in the lower right-hand corner. That is the Wisconsin crew, who later became known as the Berry Crate crew because of the incident. In 1899, they began giving out trophies to the winning Varsity 8 and freshman crews, and they add a third contest, a Varsity 4, to the regatta. Georgetown University sent its very first entry in 1900, and in 1900 they also give out a new trophy to the winning Varsity 4 crew.
So from 1901 to 1907, we have some coming and goings of different universities that join and leave the competition at Poughkeepsie. Syracuse sends its first crew in 1901 and wins their first Varsity 8 race in 1904. They actually set themselves up in the first decade of the 20th century as major competitors for Cornell. Cornell, dominates a lot of the competition during this time period. So Syracuse became someone for them to beat. Also during this period, Cornell sets a world record for a 4-mile race. And they also set a course record that holds for quite a while at Poughkeepsie. Early on in this period, there are some rumblings that the regatta may change location as different cities offer up venues because they see how successful the regatta is. Ultimately, the regatta remains at Poughkeepsie, and it doesn't upset the tradition that they are establishing. In 1907, the Naval Academy sends their first crew to Poughkeepsie, and along with the crew, they bring a number of naval vessels, destroyers, as well as smaller craft, so that the Naval Academy students can view the race. 1907, the final year in this time period, marks the last time that Georgetown competes at Poughkeepsie. They had a great deal of difficulty with finances for the crew, as well as recruiting difficulties, and just a few short years later, they shut down their crew program entirely.
So from 1908 to 1913, this regatta officially becomes known as the Poughkeepsie Regatta. Cornell comes to dominate the regatta during this time. They win all 3 races in 1903, 1909, 1910, and 1912. The picture on this slide shows 3 victorious crews and the substitutes in shells with Courtney in his launch. You may have seen this image before as being the 1895 Cornell crew, which through Elizabeth and I, through our research, we were better able to date it to this year. In 1895, there was only 1 Cornell crew to begin with, so there wouldn't have been several there in the first place. By 1910, it is commonly referred to as the Poughkeepsie Regatta, firmly establishing Poughkeepsie as the home of the IRA Regatta. To show their belief in Poughkeepsie as the home for the IRA Regatta, Columbia purchased land and built a combination boathouse and quarters at Crum Elbow in Highland on the western shore of the river. With the regatta firmly entrenched at Poughkeepsie, West Coast schools, particularly the University of Washington, began to apply for entry as early as 1908, but finances and rowing politics prevented their entry. In 1912, the winner of the Pacific Coast Regatta, which was a race between the University of Washington, University of California, Berkeley, and Stanford University, sent an entry to Poughkeepsie. Stanford University was the first to come east in 1912, and they were followed the following year by the University of Washington in 1913. However, not all is well in the world of college rowing, as concerns begin to arise about the dangers of rowing a 4-mile race. A Yale coxswain had collapsed and died after a 4-mile race in 1908, but no changes were made to the Poughkeepsie's race program at that time.
By the time we get to 1914, the concerns over 4-mile contest reaches its height, and the University of Wisconsin, who had long competed at Poughkeepsie, withdraws from Poughkeepsie and actually cancels its rowing program after they receive an unfavorable medical report on rowers who have competed in 4-mile competitions. At this point, the IRA realizes that this is a legitimate issue and they really need to seriously consider it. And I think in a lot of ways, the withdrawal of Wisconsin made them really look at this and really consider it. Because as the regatta decreased in size with the loss of Wisconsin, they also knew it would prevent other schools from competing who had the same concerns. Navy and Princeton in particular had cited the length of the race as a reason they would not compete at Poughkeepsie. As a result, they decide to shorten the race to 3 miles for the 1917 regatta. But it would not go into effect until 1920 as the regatta was suspended with U.S. involvement in World War I. Also during this time, in an effort to reinvigorate spectator interest and due to several accidents in the Varsity Four, the IRA decided to replace the Varsity Four with a Junior Varsity Eight. The Varsity Four lacked a coxswain, so they had difficulty navigating. They were prone to running into each other and running into markers on the course, so they hoped to stop those accidents from happening by having a third eight race that had a coxswain. Coach Courtney objects to this change, saying that the race will be boring if every competition is between a different set of eights. He's ultimately proven wrong, as everyone comes just as much no matter what race is there, but this is an interesting comment that he made at the time. In addition to the loss of Wisconsin, as a result of the 4-mile race length, the regatta gets smaller again in 1916 when the West Coast schools elect not to come east. They cite both finances as well as frustration over Eastern schools refusing to come west to compete with them as reasons for their withdrawal from Poughkeepsie.
So 1921 to 1924, when the regatta starts up again after World War I, the 1920 regatta was held at Cayuga Lake. This change was due to tidal conditions on the Hudson and the unavailability of an observation train, but it returned to Poughkeepsie in 1921. As a result of this move, Poughkeepsie Mayor forms the Poughkeepsie Regatta Committee in 1922 to formally handle regatta preparations and to serve as a liaison to the IRA. Navy returns to Poughkeepsie in 1921 as well, and West Coast schools resume attending the regatta with the University of California, Berkeley, the 1921 winner of the Pacific Coast Regatta. West Coast schools become regular attendees at Poughkeepsie and have some victories, with Washington winning the 1923 and 1924 Varsity 8 races. Navy sets a record for the 3-mile course in 1922. With the race reduced to 3 miles and fewer concerns about race length, Wisconsin returns in 1924.
So the period of 1925 to 1929 sees serious growth. This is a point where they are just getting bigger in all respects. In 1925, the IRA decides to reinstate the 4-mile course length for the Varsity 8, citing concerns over whether they've really established a competitive race. There was a very short time between course records being broken, so it wasn't nearly as challenging to have a 3-mile race. Along with this, they decide to lengthen the junior varsity race. It was originally 2 miles. They lengthened it to 3 to better prepare the junior varsity crews to eventually row a 4-mile race. It's also during this time that Cornell's 1901 course record is broken by California in 1928. Also in December of that year, the Poughkeepsie Regatta Committee, fresh off of having been extremely successful in planning and executing regattas, they incorporate as the Poughkeepsie Regatta Association. And one of the first things that the association does is spearhead efforts to establish permanent facilities for crews at Poughkeepsie. They acquired the Poughkeepsie Boathouse, Boat Club's Boathouse, which had been a local rowing group who had had basically lost membership and were no longer using it, and they moved it by barge up to what is now Quiet Cove Park on the Hudson River State Hospital property. You can actually see a picture of it in this on the slide. This is long after the regatta is over. There's no longer a dock in front of it. So in traditional times, there would have been a dock there. And then Navy builds quarters right next to it, you can see them on the left. So they live in the quarters and store all of their equipment in the boathouse. With the addition of MIT in 1929, they bring a varsity 8 to Poughkeepsie. The Regatta is the largest field of competitors to date, in the need for some additional facilities at Poughkeepsie.
So 1930 to 1935, the focus really is on getting these teams some permanent quarters. So MIT did not have a boathouse in 1929, and the association was not able to obtain a boathouse for them in time. They actually erected a circus tent that was rented, and it was put on the dock next to Navy's quarters for them to use as a boathouse. The Poughkeepsie Regatta Association fundraised to build permanent boathouses for MIT in 1931 and in California in 1932. Thus begins the creation of Regatta Row. There are also plans for permanent boathouse for Cornell, but the Depression delays this. And if you look at the image, that's actually an image of the 1935 Cornell varsity team. They're sitting on the dock in front of the MIT boathouse, and next to them, to their left, you can see some of the crew members from California hanging out on their balcony there with their laundry drying. Those were the first two boathouses on Regatta Row. So the regatta is canceled in 1933 as a result of financial hardships across the country. Not many crews could afford to send an entry to Poughkeepsie that year. MIT is unable to return until 1934. So the association allows Cornell to use MIT's boathouse that year, and then again in 1935. In 1935, California's boathouse was updated to be used as living quarters and not just shell storage.
So in 1936, we have the, I would say, infamous at this point, the Boys in the Boat crew, Washington. In 1936, because MIT is absent for several years, Washington is given its own permanent boathouse at Poughkeepsie. And they build a dining hall so that they can stay in the boathouse at Regatta Row and also store their equipment there and eat in a charming little dining hall. Perhaps as a result of this, Washington goes on to win all 3 races at Poughkeepsie that year, something that had previously only been accomplished by Cornell. So this was a big deal, very much like Cornell's triumph over Yale in 1897. Washington had proven itself among all of these big universities with long-established crew programs. At the same time that Washington is doing very well and has their own permanent boathouse, Cornell is forced to return to their plank boathouse, as we saw in the first slide. Looks very similar to that on the Highland side of the course, which was at this point not in great shape, as it had been, had been left abandoned for a couple years. And they had to lodge separately, actually over near Vassar College, which is on the other side of Poughkeepsie from the river, and then had to commute across the river to their boathouses. They're not terribly happy about this, and they're very anxious to have Regatta Row, and they're not really happy about the fact that construction has been delayed. At this point, they had not started construction, and the space was still being cleared so that they could build.
So in 1937 through 1941, Cornell finally gets its boathouse in 1938, which completes Regatta Row. It would be the last boathouse to be built there, even though they continued to clear space nearby. Pennsylvania elects not to attend in 1937 and does not return again until after World War II. Local papers suggest it's because they don't have a permanent boathouse, but others speculate it's because Pennsylvania has had a disappointing showing at Poughkeepsie for a while and they want to try something else. In 1940, Poughkeepsie announces that there will not be any additional construction of boathouses on Regatta Row, despite the addition of new universities. Princeton participates in 1940 for the first time, and in 1941 we see the return of MIT and Rutgers. Rutgers had sent a freshman crew in 1934.
Between 1942 and 1946, no races were held as a result of the U.S. involvement in World War II. There were plans for a regatta in 1942, but ultimately they were canceled as the war effort definitely picked up. When the regatta returns to Poughkeepsie in 1947, everyone is really excited to welcome them back. But they also have an expanded field of competitors with 11 universities, making it the largest largest regatta since 1929. This puts a strain on accommodations for the crews. They stayed 2 crews to a boathouse in 1947 on Regatta Row, but also shared Columbia's boathouse and Navy's boathouse at Quiet Cove. And they did this again in 1948 and 1949. They had let upkeep on those plank boathouses slip, and they did not repair them, so they had no place to put them except together in the boathouses in these different locations. At this point, or shortly before the war, the Poughkeepsie Junior Chamber of Commerce takes over regatta preparations. And as I said, instead of building facilities and addressing university's concerns, they hold a Mardi Gras-style parade, the crowning of a Poughkeepsie Regatta Queen, and more in both 1948 and 1949. The universities grow frustrated with Poughkeepsie and the Junior Chamber, as neither group addresses their core concerns. In 1949, with the return of Stanford, resources are even more thinly spread. Unfortunately, this would be the last Poughkeepsie Regatta.
So the departure. Poughkeepsie did not provide the universities what they needed. They didn't have enough permanent boathouses or quarters for all the crews. There was no observation train. This has not been at Poughkeepsie since before the war, and it was an important source of revenues. And they couldn't provide more funds. Poughkeepsie could not afford to offer a larger monetary contribution to the IRA. And a regard and understanding of rowing as a sport. They felt Poughkeepsie's officials and citizens had little interest in rowing at any other time during the year and only cared about it when it suited them or when the races took place in June, July of the year they were being raced. They also became frustrated with the tidal nature of the Hudson River, which had caused issues with the race scheduling as well as resulting in numerous swamped boats.
Despite Poughkeepsie's continuous efforts, the regatta moved. Oh, I skipped something. I apologize. So, as a result of this frustration, in 1950, when Marietta, Ohio approached the IRA with an offer of university dorms as quarters and observation trains, more funding, and a non-tidal river, they were open to taking it. Poughkeepsie continued to approach the IRA in attempts to return the regatta to the Hudson, but it was unsuccessful. Today, the IRA is known as it is known. They no longer call it the Poughkeepsie Regatta or even the name of the place that it's held. It rotates venues. They've changed the race format. There's no longer a 4-mile race. And women's rowing has been added, and they've added additional classes for different races. So it's not the same race any longer, and it's a very different type of rowing than they used to do. So that's the end of our presentation. As you can see here on our slide, we've posted our contact information, and we welcome you to now ask questions. I did answer one in the Q&A about what time of year were the regattas held. The regatta date varied each year, typically mid-June to early July. It all depended upon the tides and the university's schedule.
Great, thank you. Everyone who's listening in, you can just type your questions right into that Q&A box in the bottom right of your screen if you're on a computer or laptop. We did have one question that came in ahead of time about some of the specific rowers, and I know I kind of gave Ann and Elizabeth a warning about this one, but Question about the Ward brothers and the Donahue brothers and whether or not they ever competed in the Poughkeepsie Regatta, both of those being local individuals.
You can do
I'll
both.
address the Ward brothers, those were not aware, were out of Newburgh, actually. Professional rowers competed quite a few events. Unfortunately, they predate the regatta. They would not have competed at Poughkeepsie. However, Ellis Ward was the coach at the University of Pennsylvania for quite a long time, and I know that at least one of his brothers did help out from time to time with the coaching at Pennsylvania.
As far as the Donahue brothers, if we knew possibly what university they would have rowed for, we can look it up. I've done extensive research on what rowers actually rowed in what boats for the different universities that did participate. So if you knew a time frame or a school that they may have rowed for, that could help us narrow it down, and I might be able to dig up some research for you on that.
However, if they were professional rowers, they were not permitted to participate. This was strictly an amateur competition. There were several instances where there was controversy over people who had rowed for rowing clubs on a professional level who then went to a university. There was, they wanted it to be strictly amateur. So if the Donahue brothers, which I'm sorry to say I have not read, were a professional rowers, they would not have been at Poughkeepsie either. We've got some more Q&A questions.
Yeah. Are there still nationwide rowing regattas now? And if so, where are they held?
Yes, they are. There are a number of them around the country. As I said, the IRA still exists as a regatta. It's just not called the Poughkeepsie Regatta, or wherever it's located, they rotate venue. There's also the Dad Vale, and there's a number of others.
Someone was also looking for additional information on the coxswain that passed during the race, and if we know what caused that.
We don't know specifically what caused it, and at that point, I don't think they really knew. It could have been something that was unique to the individual, but a lot of times it was very hot. They would often row no matter what the weather was. So it could be very hot. That could have been a factor. Like heat stroke could have been involved. The coxswain doesn't necessarily, or at that point, didn't do a lot of work. So I can't see like strain on the heart or anything like that, which was the major concern in the University of Wisconsin's report, was that there was strain on the heart and different parts of the body. I don't know if he was too excited or not, but
someone is asking about the Cornell Boathouse that is still on the Marist campus. Is that the original? And then where were the others located in relation to that one, like south, north?
Well, yes, that is the original one that was built there on site. If you are looking at the boathouse from the river, directly to its right, the Cornell Boathouse, directly to its right would have been where California stayed, and that was there on Marist property for quite some time, but it was more dilapidated of the two and was not quite repairable, so they put their time and effort into redoing the Cornell one, and the California one had to be taken down. Still looking the same way, the next to California would have been the MIT/Washington Boathouse, and then again, all going south. The one next to that then would have been smaller, only a one-story one, not like the two-story ones that are there. And like the Cornell one would be the dining hall. That was just a small one-story that was not meant for lodging or anything. And as Elizabeth mentioned in the presentation, it was just a space for the teams to come and eat. So at one time there were 4 structures there.
And the dining hall ended in 1957, and California was damaged, but the city repaired it as it was used by local high schools. They did not replace the MIT Washington for the dining hall.
Okay, so the next question is actually about the Regatta Collection, which I know was the subject of a previous webinar. So we can actually include a link to that when we send out the link for this one. So if anyone wants to go back and see it if they didn't. But just wondering how much information is in that collection and what is kind of included. And they said, are there pictures, videos, newspaper articles?
Yes, all of the above. All of the, and more. There's equipment, there's ephemera, there is oars that are part of it, extensive images, extensive journal articles, magazine articles. Yeah.
Yeah. So you referred to local rowing clubs. Do you know what local rowing clubs were here, where and when they existed, and whether or not they were for the public?
Okay, I think I know the most about this, I think. Maybe not. So to start this off, there was the Poughkeepsie Highland Amateur Rowing Association, which existed as early as the 1890s and up through at least 1910. It was all local people from the area. Most of them, you know, they had, I don't know if they had a clubhouse. That I've not been able to find out. But they were definitely all local people, and so I don't know if they definitely had members, but I don't know if they denied access based on being a member or being part of the public for that one. The Poughkeepsie Boat Club was a Poughkeepsie-based club. Their boathouse was down by what is now Warriors Park, I think, down by the
next to Cal Rock.
Yeah, their boat club was on the shore of Poughkeepsie. They moved it a couple times. They disbanded in 1928. They definitely had members as well, but they were all local people. So I'm sure that anybody who wanted to apply for membership could have access to it. I don't think it was, you know, denied.
I don't know if you can go back to the slide, but someone was asking about the Navy boathouse that now exists at Quiet Cove. And they said that it looks different in the photo from the structure that exists now.
Okay.
Has there been changes or?
So the building that is at Quiet, there's a number of buildings at Quiet Cove that belong to the Hudson River State Psychiatric Center, also known as the Hudson River State Hospital. But the big building that is parallel to the river is not the boathouse. It's the quarters. If you've ever peered in the windows, you can see the original, probably the original 1929 kitchen. That's where they stayed. The boathouse disappeared sometime between 1949 and 1955, and it's one of those mysteries that we can't figure out if it burned down, they took it down, we don't know what happened to it. But that boathouse that we showed in our picture is no longer there. It's just the quarters. They had a separate building for that.
Interesting. Do you know how many spectators came to see the races?
It varied from year to year, but it always is somewhere in the 10,000s. There were some years where there were over, closer to 100,000, but it's a large number of people.
And I have two kind of Marist-specific questions, probably more modern, so I don't know if you know the answers to them, but one of Marist's first shells was named after Ernest Acker. Do you know who he was?
That's not a name I'm familiar with. Anne?
No, not at all. I don't. Not in our research anyways for the regatta.
Sure. And then do you know if Marist hosts any intercollegiate rowing races currently?
They did do a revival of the regatta in 2009, 2010, I think 11 and 12 as well. But at this point, I don't think they've hosted any official intercollegiate races. I do know that Marist Rowing participates in the IRA. They've been several times.
Someone actually this is more of a comment than a question. They said that they know of two current adult groups, Hudson River Rowing and Mid-Hudson Rowing, for anyone interested in trying it out for themselves.
Yes.
And then I think this might be our last question, but it says, are there any pictures of the Columbia Boathouse that was on the west bank of the Hudson?
Yes, we have a couple. We do not know what happened to it.
It was there until the mid-90s, as far as we know. We have a picture dating till about then, and then it is gone. It was last used as a private residence, actually.
Huh. Oh, we had one more question sneak in. It says that they heard that gambling and spectator fighting was a black mark on the Poughkeepsie Regatta. Is that true?
I don't know that it was a black mark. There was always gambling at sporting competitions, no matter what they did. But there was definitely gambling. The biggest problem, I think, that they had was often the pickpockets who would move through the crowd. The police were always after them. I think a lot of times they would try to stamp out the gambling because they didn't want it to go on, but they knew it was going to happen no matter what they did. I was tracking at one point how often they outlawed gambling, and it was like every year, but then you'd read another article or someone's account, and they'd talk about how they had a pool going, and everybody like knew it was going on.
Yeah. Yeah, it had to be hard to control with that many thousands of people showing up.
Oh, I have a couple private questions. Is it okay if I answer them?
Absolutely.
Okay. The question is, the regatta was moved because the Hudson was a tidal river. Does that mean the river changes direction of the current and would affect the race times based on the current? Absolutely. They didn't want to row at low tide. They would try and schedule them when they could, optimum tide, but oftentimes even the changing of the tides would actually make it difficult to race. And then, was there a boathouse at St. Andrews before it became the CIA? I don't know for certain if the St. Andrews, which was the religious order that owned the property before it became the culinary, I don't know if they had their own personal boathouse. When Columbia stayed there in 1895 at the original house that actually the St. Andrews brothers took down, they used a boathouse that was further down the river that belonged to someone else. So I can't speak for certain if there was a boathouse there or not.
We had someone in the chat who said that they're a current rower on the course, and that tide has a huge impact, and it can frequently add 1 to 2 minutes faster in one direction than going in the opposite direction. So
yeah, there was one year they actually debated changing the direction and rowing upriver instead as a result of how everything was going. So I believe it.
We also have a number of people who are clearly very knowledgeable on local rowing, because we had 3 different people tell us that Marist hosted the President's Cup Regatta on the Hudson up until 2 years ago. It was always West Point and Marist and would include other colleges varying over the years. And I think that's the main information that I'm gleaning from this.
All right. Thank you. That's very helpful. Not my area of specialty. I'm sorry I can't speak to it with any authority. I did find one more question, though. When did Marist start a rowing program, and when was the Marist Boathouse built? I don't know the exact date of the program start. I do know that the Martin Boathouse or Marist Boathouse was built in 1964 or 3. And help. 4 or 3? 1963 or 1964. I know I read information about when they were planning it. So they either started in 63 and finished in 64, one or the other, but it was that time period.
I'm not sure if this question is specifically for, I'm assuming so, for the Poughkeepsie Regatta course itself, but do you know what the record was for the 4-mile distance?
The record that was established in 1901, which was the one that set up the world record, 18 minutes and 53, and I can't remember exactly with it. Oh, and someone's told us that Marist started rowing in 1961 or 62. There seems to be disagreement.
And then someone said that the boathouse itself opened in 64 because it was their freshman year.
Gotcha.
So that time frame.
I was in the right region.
Yeah. So I think that is all of the questions. I know that was like rapid fire as we had a whole bunch coming in, unless you have any additional ones that came into you privately, or are you guys set?
Weren't there ones that were submitted before? I saw them.
You actually
I think we covered
them all.
them.
Yeah, because there was a question about the boys in the boat, whether or not they went as far south as Newburgh, which you guys definitely talked about.
Oh, and there was one about who had
schools
what boathouses, and we talked about that. So yeah, you're right. We got everybody.
So you were very efficient in covering all the 3 questions in your actual presentation. So in consideration of everyone's time, I'm just going to go ahead and wrap up. Thank you everyone for joining us and keeping the Marist Alumni Association in your life. And obviously, thank you to Elizabeth and Anne for spending time with us and sharing their expertise. A full recording of this presentation will be available in a few days on the Virtual Opportunities page on the Marist Alumni website. I'll post that link for you in the chat box in just a second, and we will also be emailing that out for you as well. So thank you again, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your day.